What's up, everyone? It's Jimmy here, just asking you to hit like and subscribe and the notification bell and turn on all notifications. Also, drop a comment down below and let me know where you're listening from, or drop a quick, I'm doing my part. On March 5th, 1974, 17-year-old Amy Billig left her home in Coconut Grove, Florida, to meet her father at his art gallery about a mile away. She often hitchhiked around the neighborhood, as was the style at the time, and that afternoon she stood by the roadside with her thumb out on the highway. Witnesses saw Amy getting into a vehicle, but she never arrived at her father's gallery and never met her friends for lunch as planned. The high school senior simply vanished without a trace, turning an ordinary day into one of Florida's most haunting unsolved mysteries. When Amy failed to return home that evening, her mother, Susan Billig, immediately knew something was wrong. Amy had phoned earlier to say she'd be back after meeting her dad, so the family quickly reported her missing. At first, police hesitated to act, suggesting the teenager might turn up by morning. But by March 6th, a full investigation was launched. With no sign of Amy locally, a surprising clue surfaced on March 18th. Her camera was found near a highway exit, 250 miles north of Miami. The film inside yielded only one hazy photo, a light-colored pickup truck by a vine-covered wall, and no clear evidence. Investigators couldn't trace the truck or the location in the picture. Desperate for leads, her parents blanketed South Florida with missing person flyers, hired a private investigator, and held press conferences to keep Amy's story in the public eye. Despite extensive media coverage and community fundraisers to aid the search, weeks passed with no breakthrough. Early in the investigation, a disturbing theory took shape. Amy may have been abducted by an outlaw biker gang passing through the area. On the very day Amy disappeared, two notorious biker clubs, the Outlaws and the Pagans, had been traveling through Coconut Grove en route to a bike rally in Daytona Beach. Multiple tips and sightings soon tied Amy's fate to these gangs. A woman calling herself Susan Johnson phoned to claim Amy was taken by the Outlaws and had been seen with bikers in Daytona. Indeed, the Outlaws had ridden through Miami that day. Susan Billig even met with a couple of bikers, who initially vowed to help. However, as she kept digging, these same bikers later told her to stop looking further, fueling fears of a cover-up within the biker world. Also, telling a grieving mother looking for her daughter to stop looking at the bikers clearly just raised more suspicion. As they say, you only take flak when you're flying over the target. Credible sightings of Amy with bikers continued to emerge as time went on. In Orlando, a convenience store manager insisted he saw Amy come in with a biker group to buy vegetarian soup. This was a detail that gave Susan hope, since Amy was a vegetarian, and that fact wasn't public knowledge. The strongest lead came from within another gang. In late 1975, Paul Branch, a member of the Pagans, contacted Susan after seeing Amy's photo in a newspaper. Branch claimed he had kept Amy for a time after obtaining her from another biker, and he even described a hidden 2-inch scar on her abdomen from an appendectomy. This private detail convinced Susan that Branch had truly encountered her daughter. Disturbingly, the details suggest that she was trafficked between the bikers. For reasons that are unclear, Branch promised to help get Amy back, but his leads only sent Susan on wild goose chases. At one arranged rendezvous in Tulsa, Branch promised to bring Amy back to her family. However, he was never able to produce her, and he later claimed other bikers attacked him for cooperating. Branch subsequently cut off all communications with the family, but keep him in the back of your mind, because he's going to play another major role decades later. Despite these frustrations, both the family and police saw a biker gang abduction as the most plausible explanation for Amy's disappearance. Over the years, Amy's loved ones endured numerous hoaxes and false leads that compounded their ordeal. 16 days after Amy vanished, the Billigs received a phone call from someone claiming to have kidnapped her, demanding $30,000 ransom. The caller even let a girl scream in the background, making Susan believe for a moment that her daughter was alive. A drop-off was arranged at a Miami Beach hotel, but it turned out to be an extortion scam by 16-year-old twin boys with no connection to Amy. Unfortunately, this incident would be a harmless prank in comparison to the sinister activities of the next individual. For 21 years, Susan Billig was tormented by a man who repeatedly phoned her, claiming he had Amy, and graphically describing supposed acts he did to her. Disturbingly, he would be actively engaging with himself while tormenting Susan, while she would try to record every detail he gave. This caller, who gave the name Johnson, would taunt Susan for years, often calling from untraceable payphones and keeping her in constant anguish. The family couldn't change their phone number because they wanted Amy to be able to call home if she escaped from her captors. Further, just to show how psychologically manipulative this caller was, he would claim that Amy was still alive and captive. In essence, on the off chance he was telling the truth, she needed to sit through his sick games in hopes he slipped up. In 1995, the FBI finally traced one of these calls and unmasked the culprit, Henry Johnson Blair, a U.S. Customs Service agent. Blair was arrested and admitted he had derived physical pleasure from cruelly tormenting Amy's family, though he insisted he knew nothing about her actual fate. He was convicted of stalking and served 2 years in prison. Later, an eerie coincidence emerged. Amy's diary, written weeks before she vanished, mentioned a man named Hank, who'd invited her to South America. Notably, Blair went by the nickname Hank and lived in the area at the time of her disappearance. He also drove a van that was similar to one that Amy had pictures of in some undeveloped film in her room. However, no direct evidence ever linked Blair to the disappearance beyond his decades of cruel phone harassment. A major break in the case finally came 24 years later, though it brought more horror than relief. In 1998, Miami police announced they had received a confession from a dying man. Paul Branch, the Pagans biker who had reached out to Susan years before, was on his deathbed in late 1997 and allegedly confessed to his wife that Amy had been abducted. But this time the story was much different, and he said that she had been slain the very day she was taken. According to Branch's confession, members of the Pagans Motorcycle Club picked up Amy as she hitchhiked and took her to a party at their clubhouse in the Florida Everglades. There, the gang assaulted her. Branch claimed that roughly 24 bikers engaged in horrific acts against Amy. When she resisted the advances of this group, they injected her with a substance to make her docile. When she kept fighting back, they kept administering doses of this unknown substance until she ultimately perished. Afterwards, the bikers disposed of her body in an alligator-infested swamp, where Branch believes that her body was consumed by the animals. One detective on the case said Branch's wife provided numerous details that matched confidential aspects of the investigation, lending credibility to the gruesome story. However, without physical evidence or identified perpetrators to charge, the authorities couldn't confirm the allegations and close out the case definitively. This story does have some problems, however, given the number of credible and verified sightings of Amy in the weeks following the abduction. The fact that she was seen months later purchasing vegetarian food while in the company of a biker gang makes it seem that Branch may not have been telling the truth in his confession. However, that said, since the confession was filtered through his wife and Branch was no longer alive, this may explain the discrepancies. She may have simply misunderstood the timeline he was trying to convey, or he may have been unclear on the timeline himself. Personally, though, I still have to wonder about the connection with Hank. the man who called and harassed the family for 20 years. He claimed not to know who Amy was, but by the time 20 years had passed, there would have been no paper trail on his end to prove it. Amy's mention of an individual called Hank who wanted to take her away just weeks prior suggests something more to me. Further, I find it highly suspicious that this Hank from the diary never came forward to help the investigation if he wasn't involved. Still, this doesn't provide an explanation for why Amy was seen in the company of the bikers. Unfortunately for Amy's remaining family members, the authorities are no closer to cracking her case today than the day she disappeared. I personally think that nothing out of Branch can be trusted. After all, he's a confirmed liar who led on Amy's parents with promises of returning her. He was either lying about the initial story or lying about the disturbing story at the clubhouse. On a chilly day in February 1971, two hitchhikers traveling along Interstate 75 in Central Florida made a gruesome discovery beneath the Lake Panasoffkee overpass. In the shallow waters of Shady Brook Creek beneath that bridge lay the body of a young woman, badly decomposed after roughly a month in the water. A man's leather belt was still wrapped around her neck, and it appeared her body had been bundled up and dropped from the overpass into the marsh below. With no identification on the victim, authorities dubbed her Little Miss Lake Panasoffkee, after the nearby lake. For more than half a century, that nickname was all anyone knew her by, as law enforcement struggled to uncover her identity until now. Local law enforcement in Sumter County started investigating immediately, but identifying the victim proved difficult with 1971's limited forensic tools. The woman appeared to be in her late teens or early 20s, small in stature with dark hair and brown eyes. She was found wearing distinctive green clothing, plaid pants, a matching shirt, and a floral patterned shawl, along with a gold necklace, a ring, and a Baylor wristwatch. These details were carefully recorded, and police circulated descriptions nationwide, yet no missing person report matched the victim. An autopsy confirmed she had been strangled with the belt, likely weeks before her discovery. Heartbreakingly, examiners also determined that the young woman had given birth to children in the past. Somewhere, it seemed, she had family who didn't know what had become of her. Despite extensive effort, the early investigation yielded no leads. The unknown woman was laid to rest in a local cemetery as a Jane Doe, her grave marker bearing the placeholder name that the community had given her. Over the next several decades, investigators refused to let the Little Miss Lake Panasoffkee case be forgotten. In 1986, her remains were exhumed to take advantage of improved forensic techniques. Specialists re-examined her bones and teeth, confirming the victim's general profile and noting signs of prior medical care, such as dental work and a healed ankle surgery. Critically, they reaffirmed that she had given birth to at least 2 children, a clue that could have narrowed searches, yet still no identity was found. In 1992, the case was featured on the show Unsolved Mysteries, bringing national attention to the story. For those of you who are unaware of what a cultural phenomenon this show was at the time, the first run of an episode would be watched by 10 million households in North America. Tips came in and police compared countless missing persons cases, but no match emerged. Incredibly, at least one family member watched the Unsolved Mysteries episode without realizing it was about their missing relative. In 2006, they submitted the victim's fingerprints to the FBI's national database, hoping she might have a record, but no hits turned up at the time. By the late 2000s, the team turned to advanced DNA testing and genetic genealogy. Unfortunately, her DNA was in poor condition and produced no useful matches. One scientific analysis even suggested the victim may have spent her childhood in Greece, based on isotope clues in her remains. This led investigators down a frustrating false trail, theorizing she could have been a recent immigrant. Despite all these efforts, the young woman's name remained unknown as the case approached its 55th year. Then the breakthrough finally came in 2025, not from genetic genealogy, but from fingerprints. The Sumter County Sheriff's Office had acquired a cutting-edge fingerprint matching system that uses artificial intelligence to compare degraded fingerprints to complete copies. In October 2025, the system returned a stunning result, a match to fingerprints from a 1970 arrest in Hillsborough County, Florida. After 54 years, Little Miss Lake Panisofsky suddenly had a name. The arrest record identified her as Cookie Rowan, who had been booked in 1970 on a minor charge involving a bad check. Investigators quickly confirmed that the fingerprints and all other details matched the long unidentified victim. In late October 2025, Sheriff Patrick Breeden announced that the mystery of her identity was solved. At a press conference, Sheriff Breeden declared that Little Miss Lake Panisofsky finally had a name, as he revealed Cookie's identity to the world. It was a triumphant and emotional moment for the cold case team and the community. Cookie Rowan turned out to be a 21-year-old local woman and mother, and hadn't grown up in Greece. Tellingly, she had never even been reported missing back in 1971, a fact that helps explain why identification was so difficult. Ironically, the key to identifying her had been in law enforcement files for years. Her fingerprints were uploaded to the FBI database in 2013, long after the initial search. However, until this new cutting-edge technology could compare the degraded fingerprint from her body to the perfect print taken by the cops, the connection couldn't be made. And honestly, it's kind of interesting to see ultra-high-tech forensic solutions that don't involve forensic genetic genealogy once in a while. Once her identity was confirmed, a fuller picture of Cookie Rowan emerged. She was born and raised in the United States, and had never even been to Greece, proving that isotope analysis can be problematic. By age 21, Cookie was the mother of 2 young children. She lived in the Tampa area and had married Charles Emery Rowan. However, Cookie's personal life was troubled. Her marriage was reportedly tumultuous, and she had separated from her husband shortly before she disappeared. The exact circumstances around her disappearance are still hazy. Those close to her may not have realized she was truly missing, and some have speculated that a narrative may have been spun by the perpetrator that she abandoned her children. Her now grown children and other relatives finally learned what happened to their long-lost mother. In a public statement, the family expressed deep gratitude to the investigators and the community who never gave up. Identifying Cookie answered the biggest question in the Lake Panisofsky case, but the mystery isn't entirely over. Investigators also identified a person of interest in her slaying: her estranged husband, Charles Emery Rowan. Emery Rowan would have been 85 years old in 2025, and he died in 2015, taking any secrets he had to the grave. While he can never be formally charged or interrogated, detectives suspect he may have been involved in Cookie's death given the circumstances and their history together. The case remains open as an active investigation, with authorities continuing to gather information about Cookie's final days and anyone who might have been responsible. Personally, I hope the authorities keep digging on this one, since while there is an incredibly obvious suspect, the details of her disappearance are presently unknown. For instance, it's always possible that Cookie had entered into a new relationship after the separation, and this completely unknown person may be responsible. That said, though, I think the most obvious explanation is likely that her former spouse did it and then claimed she left the state and abandoned her children. This may be why her own family members never ended up bringing her case to the authorities. Hey everyone, Just a quick reminder to like and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Also, don't forget that you can help out my channel by clicking the join button or checking out the Patreon. Picture yourself alone in a room. Suddenly you feel a hand on your face. It's stroking your forehead, then scratching you. You look around, and the hand is your own. You try to pull it away, but it resists. A few hours later, it grabs your throat. Your left hand is trying to strangle you, and you need to fight it off with your right hand. This isn't a scene from a horror flick. It's the lived reality for individuals with alien hand syndrome, one of the most unsettling conditions in all of neurology. It's a rare disorder where a part of your own body ceases to be your own, becoming a terrifying autonomous agent acting with a will of its own. What defines this bizarre condition is a profound and terrifying loss of control. Alien hand syndrome is a neurological disorder in which a person's limb, usually a hand, performs complex, goal-directed actions on their own. In essence, it's like an intrusive thought, but for your limbs rather than your brain. The key features that separate it from other movement disorders are twofold. First, the movements are sophisticated and purposeful, like unbuttoning a shirt, grabbing objects, or even something more sinister. Second, the patient experiences a deep sense of psychological estrangement from the limb, feeling that it is foreign or controlled by an external force. The root cause of alien hand syndrome is always some form of brain damage that disrupts the intricate network of volitional motor control. In a healthy brain, the simple decision to move an arm activates vast, coordinated networks of neurons. In a person with the syndrome, functional brain scans show that this activation is strangely isolated, occurring in specific motor areas without the usual monitoring activity from other regions. This points to a disconnection syndrome, where critical brain regions can no longer communicate effectively, leading to a kind of conflict between intention and action. The damage typically occurs in one of three key areas. The first is the corpus callosum, the massive bundle of nerve fibers that acts as a bridge between the brain's left and right hemispheres. The second is the frontal lobe, which is essential for planning, decision-making, and initiating voluntary movements. The third is the parietal lobe, responsible for integrating sensory information and creating our internal map of our body and space. Damage to these communication hubs reveals a profound truth. Our sense of being a single, unified agent isn't a given. It's an emergent property, a fragile harmony created by the constant, high-speed dialogue between different parts of the brain. When that dialogue is severed, the self can fracture. This neurological damage gives rise to distinct clinical variations of the syndrome, each linked to the specific location of the brain damage. The frontal variant is often characterized by compulsive and impulsive actions of the dominant hand. The hand might involuntarily grope for nearby objects or reflexively grasp tools, with the person finding it incredibly difficult to let go. In this form, patients are typically aware that the rogue limb is their own, but they feel powerless to inhibit its impulsive actions. The callosal variant is the classic presentation of conflict, where the two hands seem to be acting opposed to one another. This typically affects the non-dominant hand and is a direct result of damage to the corpus callosum, severing the communication lines between the two hemispheres. Perhaps the most bizarre form is the posterior variant. This type is linked to damage in the parietal lobe and is characterized by strange, levitating movements of the arm and a profound denial of ownership of the limb. The movements are often less purposeful, more like aimless waving or posturing. One study documented a 77-year-old woman experienced this after strokes in both parietal lobes, watching in terror as her left hand began stroking her face and hair of its own accord. Within the scientific literature, there's a subtle but important distinction that often gets lost in popular explanations of the syndrome. An anarchic hand describes a limb that performs unintended, goal-directed movements, but the patient never denies that the hand is their own. They experience a loss of agency, the feeling of being in control, but not a loss of ownership. They might be frustrated and believe their hand won't listen, but they recognize the hand as part of their body. A true alien hand, by contrast, involves the core feeling of non-belonging. Here the patient experiences a loss of ownership, feeling the limb is foreign or attached to them by mistake. For people living this syndrome, they come to believe that the limb itself is essentially a foreign object grafted onto their body. Living with this internal stranger is a daily struggle that is frustrating, frightening, and deeply isolating. Patients report high levels of anxiety, depression, and paranoia as they can no longer trust a part of their own body. At present, further research on alien hand syndrome is needed to clarify its underlying neural mechanisms and improve treatment. Although current evidence links the syndrome to lesions in the corpus callosum, frontal, or parietal lobes, the precise pathways responsible remain poorly understood. Essentially, at present, scientists have discovered the why of this medical mystery, but not the how. Marlene Santana was just 3 days old when she was forcibly abducted from her mother's arms in Brooklyn, New York, on October 21, 1985. The kidnapping occurred outside Brookdale Hospital as Marlene's mother was leaving the maternity ward to take her newborn daughter home. Moments earlier, Marlene's mother, 23-year-old Francesca Santana, had encountered an unfamiliar woman near the nursery. This woman openly admired her baby, calling little Marlene, quote, the prettiest and most quiet infant there. Francesca appreciated the kind words and had no reason to suspect the stranger's intentions. She could not have imagined that this same woman would soon turn a joyful day into a nightmare. That evening around 9:30 p.m., as Francesca left the hospital accompanied by her little one and her relatives, the same woman confronted them, holding a weapon. The stranger announced she had been waiting all day and suddenly pointed the weapon at the baby's head, threatening to shoot if they did not cooperate. The terrified mother and her two companions were forced to walk about 6 blocks away from the hospital into a desolate area near a junkyard. Initially, Francesca thought it might be a robbery, but the true motive became clear when the woman demanded that Marlene be handed over. Desperate to save her child's life, Francesca complied, and after all, what choice did she have when this woman had a weapon pointed at Marlene? In a final plea, the distraught mother even gave the abductor her phone number and begged her to call. The kidnapper then jumped into a waiting car driven by an accomplice and sped away with baby Marlene. With that, the Santana family's newborn daughter had vanished into the night, never to be seen again. Shocked and heartbroken, Francesca and her relatives rushed to notify the police immediately after the abduction. Investigators quickly mobilized, and detectives were assigned to the case within hours. Francesca was able to provide details of the getaway vehicle, describing it as a white 1976 Chevy Malibu, with red lettering on the door. This car was possibly an unlicensed taxi, which suggested the abductor had planned her escape in advance. At the hospital, police interviewed staff and witnesses to gather a description of the unknown woman who had interacted with the baby's mother. A sketch of the suspect was soon drawn from these accounts. And yes, this is one of those times where you're going to want to look at the screen if you just listen. I've seen a lot of police sketches before, but this woman's malevolence and cruelty is somehow perfectly captured by the forensic artist. The woman was described as being around 5'2" and appeared to be in her mid to late 20s in 1985. Witnesses noted she had light reddish blonde hair, but that it was possibly dyed or a wig. According to witnesses, she was identified as likely being a Hispanic female, which some speculate may be why she targeted Marlene Santana, but I'll come back to that. From the beginning, law enforcement suspected that the kidnapper's motive was deeply personal rather than financial. There was no ransom demand or contact from the abductor despite the mother's plea to call her. Some investigators theorized that the culprit was not a professional criminal, but rather an emotionally unstable woman who was unable to have a child of her own. This profile fit a pattern seen in some infant abductions. A woman who has suffered a miscarriage or stillbirth, and in desperation, abducts a baby to raise as her own. Because in these cases the woman was already pregnant, the woman can simply register the abducted baby as her own, claiming that she gave birth at home. Notably, some have speculated that the mysterious woman may have abducted Marlene because she looked like she could plausibly be her own baby. Detectives pursued this angle by checking hospital records and investigating women in the area who had recently lost a baby or suffered a miscarriage. Despite these efforts, no viable suspect was identified. The trail was frustratingly cold, with the abductor having vanished without leaving clear clues to her identity. I do have to question how this woman had access to the maternity ward without leaving some form of identification with staff. But that said, I suppose maternity wards are accustomed to having visitors come and go, and security and privacy regulations in the 80s were different beasts than they are today. In a strange coincidence, another infant was kidnapped in New York City just one day before Marlene's abduction. On October 20th, 1985, a 2-month-old boy named Christopher Morgan was snatched from a Manhattan hospital by a woman impersonating a nurse. That case, however, saw a swift resolution. The baby boy was found safe a few days later at the home of his abductor. She had tried to pass him off as her own child after experiencing a stillbirth. Police soon arrested that woman and determined that her crime was unrelated to Marlene's disappearance. In the days and weeks following Marlene's abduction, the case received significant media attention in the New York area. Francesca made heart-wrenching public pleas for her daughter's return. Despite widespread news coverage and the dissemination of the suspect's sketch, detectives reported no major leads in Marlene's case. The lack of progress was understandably agonizing for the family. As months turned into years with no answers, the Santanas were left to grapple with fear and grief. Marlene's father, Thomas, had been in the Dominican Republic at the time of the birth, and after the incident, he and Francesca decided it was too painful to remain in the United States. They returned home to raise their other children, all while keeping hope alive that Marlene might one day be found. The family went on to have 2 more children back in the Dominican Republic. While some have suggested the family leaving the United States is potentially suspicious, the authorities have ruled out the family as being involved in the crime. Further, all members of the family were always fully cooperative and open with the police and the investigation. On the investigative front, Marlene's case has remained open and periodically received renewed attention. The way I personally found out about this case was through an old segment on Unsolved Mysteries, and like many, the case has always stuck with me given the horror of it. This segment initially aired in January 1989 and was periodically re-aired over the following decades before making its way onto streaming services. This segment has led to hundreds of leads over the years, but none have panned out. Agencies have released age-progressed images to show what Marlene might look like as she grew older. Law enforcement also publicized a distinctive detail that could help identify Marlene. She was born with a slight foot deformity, causing her feet to curve inward in a C shape. If Marlene is alive, this congenital trait might still be observable and serve as a clue to her identity. Today, Marlene would be nearly 40 years old, and her case remains unsolved. Thankfully, her information is maintained in missing persons databases, including DNA profiles from her biological family, in hopes of a future match. In the absence of a resolution, several theories have been explored regarding what happened to baby Marlene. The prevailing theory among law enforcement is that the abductor was a woman desperate for a child to call her own. And since I've already gone over that theory, there's no need to rehash it. Another theory considered both by authorities and the public is that Marlene might have been abducted for an illegal adoption or baby selling scheme. In the mid-1980s, there were fears of underground networks that would obtain infants and sell them to adoptive parents willing to pay. It's conceivable that the woman who took Marlene was acting as a broker or agent for such a black market adoption. Under this scenario, Marlene could have been handed off to another individual or family shortly after the abduction and raised far from New York. Some have speculated she might even have been taken out of the country as an infant, making her much harder to trace. However, investigators generally doubt that this was a professionally planned crime. The abductor's brazen approach, grabbing a baby in person with a weapon, and her emotional interaction with the mother suggest a crime of opportunity fueled by personal emotion. Notably, while trafficking operations do exist, no evidence of a wider adoption ring was ever uncovered in connection with Marlene's disappearance. On occasion, women of roughly Marlene's age have come forward, wondering if they might be the missing child, especially if they grew up without birth records or with uncertain family histories. Authorities have investigated a few such cases, including conducting DNA tests to check for a match to Marlene's family, but so far none have confirmed her identity. The authorities continue to work under the belief that Marlene is alive, or at least that she wasn't slain by her abductor. While it is possible that Marlene did not survive long after the abduction, there is no direct evidence of harm, and the consensus of investigators is that the kidnapper wanted the baby alive. So I feel like I've said this many times before, but this is a case that will likely be solved through the popularization of DNA testing services. If Marlene did survive, I imagine that one day she may hand her DNA over to find out all the details on her background and find out she has a bunch of familial connections that make no sense. Marlene's immediate family still lives in the Dominican Republic, but I hope they've entered their DNA into all the big testing services so they can match if this ever occurs. The Bayeux Tapestry is one of the most renowned artifacts of the medieval world, but despite its fame, who commissioned it remains a medieval English mystery. Despite its name, it's not a woven tapestry at all, but rather a 230-foot-long embroidered linen cloth. This extraordinary artwork depicts the events leading up to the Norman conquest of England in 1066, culminating with the famous Battle of Hastings. It shows how King Edward the Confessor's death led to Harold Godwinson's contested rise to the English throne, and how William, Duke of Normandy, invaded to claim it. Created in the late 11th century and preserved in Bayeux, France, the tapestry provides a vivid visual record of this pivotal historical moment. For generations, the question of who commissioned the Bayeux Tapestry has intrigued historians. A popular legend once credited Queen Matilda, William the Conqueror's wife, with assigning the task to her ladies-in-waiting. In fact, the tapestry was often nicknamed Queen Matilda's Tapestry. However, no contemporary evidence supports that story, and modern scholarship instead points to another patron behind this vast project. Today, the leading theory is that it was commissioned by Bishop Odo of Bayeux, William's half-brother. Odo was a powerful figure in the aftermath of the conquest, serving as Bishop of Bayeux and as Earl of Kent in England. Several clues strengthen the case for Odo's patronage. He appears prominently throughout the tapestry, second only to William and Harold in appearances. These include a scene where he blesses a feast for the Norman army and another where he rallies the Norman troops in battle. Historians generally believe that this is an unusual emphasis on the bishop if he played no hand in its commissioning. Notably, the tapestry was also found in Bayeux Cathedral, a church that Odo built and dedicated in the 1070s, suggesting it was originally made for display there. Further, minor characters of no real historical significance are included in the tapestry, such as Waddard, a minor nobleman. This is significant because him and other minor figures appearing by name were recorded in the Doomsday Book as tenants of Odo. Together, these details make a compelling case that Bishop Odo was the one who commissioned the work. Many believe the tapestry was first displayed in 1077 at the dedication of Odo's new cathedral in Bayeux, with King William in attendance. Unfurling this huge embroidered chronicle in such a setting would have dramatically driven home the Normans' version of history to everyone present. In that sense, the tapestry was medieval propaganda, designed to reinforce the legitimacy of King William's claim over all others vying for the English throne in 1066. While Odo is the leading candidate, scholars have explored other theories. Some suggest that King William himself, or another Norman lord, might have ordered the tapestry to commemorate the victory. An unusual hypothesis even proposes an English patron, for example, Edith of Wessex, King Edward's widow and Harold's sister, as the sponsor. According to this theory, it portrays some of the defeated Anglo-Saxons with a degree of dignity, hinting that the sponsor may have been Anglo-Saxon. However, this theory isn't widely accepted, and though it can't be confirmed with certainty, Bishop Odo appears to be the man behind this legendary artifact.